Hi, let me begin by saying thank you for attending this talk. Today I want to tell you about a computational science class that I'm developing at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Now, an important aspect of this class is that the curriculum has been designed to make the class suitable for all majors, in particular non-technical majors that fall outside of the STEM disciplines. So here's an outline of what I intend to cover today. First, I'd like to share with you my motivations for creating this class. Then I'll give you a quick overview of an educational ecosystem called Bricklayer. Now, Bricklayer is important in this context because the curriculum that I'm developing is Bricklayer-based. And after that, I'll spend the rest of the talk describing the portions of the curriculum that relate to computational science. In particular, the study of patterns and modeling and simulation involving percolation and infectious diseases. In 2015, Christopher Mims published an article in the Wall Street Journal in which he made the prediction that in the future, no profession is untouched by machines. And I would say that this prediction has aged remarkably well, and there is now broad consensus that some form of computational literacy is vital to all citizens belonging to technologically advanced societies. Now, unfortunately, academia has not yet caught up with this reality. And so the problem is, for example, how would you get an English major to enroll in a computer science class? And my solution to this problem was to create a computer science class that could also be counted in fulfillment of our university's Gen Ed science requirements. And this is key because the Gen Ed science requirements are mandatory. And so the hope then is that by having this kind of a class, students would see it as an attractive way to satisfy their Gen Ed science requirements. All right, so I had mentioned earlier that the curriculum of this class is Bricklayer-based. Full disclosure, I am the creator of the Bricklayer educational ecosystem, and I'm also a co-founder of the nonprofit Bricklayer.org. And Bricklayer was created to basically to provide a resource to people that wanted to learn more about mathematical thinking, computational thinking, and coding in an engaging way. And at the end of the day, Bricklayer programs are written in the functional programming language SML. And just as a point of reference, SML is a close cousin of the functional programming language Haskell. So here is some pixel art that was created using Bricklayer. This is 2D pixel art. You can also create artifacts in 3D space. Bricklayer output can be displayed in a variety of ways. There's some custom display tools that I've developed, but it also ties in with LDraw, Lego Digital Designer. You can even create artifacts in Bricklayer artifacts in Minecraft worlds. You can pull Bricklayer artifacts out of the virtual world into the real world and 3D print them. And you can also generate Lego build instructions for the Bricklayer artifacts that you've created. So what you see here is a Mobius strip that I coded up in Bricklayer and then generated build instructions for, bought the Lego bricks and so on, and put it together. And the decorations here are from my daughter. All right, so the computational science class begins with an informal study of patterns. And patterns, I would say, are very important and occur in all walks of life. Ray Kurzweil takes this a step further and basically equates pattern recognition with intelligence and says that basically expertise is just the familiarity of patterns in a particular field. Now, the National Science Teachers Association in the United States has a lot of nice things to say about patterns as well. They've remarked that noticing patterns is often a first step to organizing phenomena and asking scientific questions about why and how the patterns occur. And it's because of these kinds of observations that they have classified patterns as a concept that cross-cuts all the sciences. And so the Bricklayer ecosystem has a number of web apps. And one of the web apps that it has is basically electronic graph paper. So you can, through mouse clicks, you can color cells in a grid. And so the class starts, I tell the students informally, what it means to be a pattern. There has to be some kind of a repeating element to it and so on. And then I give them a sort of an open-ended create a pattern assignment. So this is a submission to that assignment by one student. Here's another pattern created by another student. And then here's a pattern that I created. And this pattern, the aspects of it that repeat increase in size exponentially, and this pattern is a kind of a fractal. And so this gets us to ultimately this kind of a question, right? So this is a tile floor in a restaurant. This is a picture I took a few years back. And the question here is this a pattern? And you might want to think about just a little bit the kind of thought processes you would have to go through to answer this question one way or the other. And so I wanted students to experience this in the Bricklayer class, but the class is an asynchronous online class. And so what I did then is, the thought experiment is, if you were to look at a pattern created by a fellow student in this class, could you continue working on the pattern? In other words, comprehensively increase the size of the pattern created by your peer. And there may be a couple of reasons why you might not be able to do this. One is actually not a pattern. There's not enough information in here to pin down all the elements, all the repeating elements in this pattern. It may be that it actually is a pattern, but you don't understand the pattern yourself. So there's, again, a couple of reasons. And so what I created to let students run this thought experiment is an online art gallery viewable through a browser, where the paintings are basically the patterns created by your peers. And you can rate patterns. Those are the circles below the paintings. So you can rate each painting. You can submit your ratings to an online leaderboard, and then you can go to a summary page that shows you collectively how the students in the class have rated the various patterns. So here's what this experience would look like. Right, you walk around in here, for each one of the paintings, right, and this is an assignment that I give them, you do a peer review. So let's say I like this pattern. I don't think it's the best, but I think it's pretty good. So I would go around and rate all of those, submit my results to the leaderboards, and then this is what I would get back. So there are 46 reviews for these patterns at this time. It's kind of like a Yelp review for restaurants. All right, so after this initial assignment, we spend a little bit more time discussing properties of patterns, in particular symmetry. And since we're dealing with a grid-based, pixel art-based system, a cell-based system, we're going to not look at all symmetries. We'll look at just horizontal and vertical reflection and twofold and fourfold rotation. And that's it. And so there are cell-based translations, so algorithms that are cell-based that let you determine whether an artifact has a certain kind of a symmetry, or to create an artifact that has such a symmetry. And these algorithms, at least at the cell level, are fairly manageable. They get a little trickier when you're talking about rotations, especially fourfold rotations. Now, doing this kind of a cell-based translation is labor intensive, right? And so I want students to have practice with this. So there is a Bricklayer web app called Mystique that lets you practice develop your understanding of these kinds of symmetries, right? And so in this assignment here, you're supposed to do a vertical reflection of the artifact that you see on the left. The web app is interactive. You submit answers. It automatically grades it, telling you if you got it right or not, and you can see the answer if you get stuck as well. And so while it is true that you can do a cell-based translation here, or construction, given the simplicity of this shape and maybe the familiarity of it, it might be within the realm of reason to consider just flipping the whole thing in your mind's eye. And in some sense, that's one of the primary goals of Mystique, is to encourage you to think that way, because that sort of exercises and develops your visual spatial skills. And those can be developed. Research has shown that, and they are very important to the STEM disciplines. Research has also shown that. And so the kinds of artifacts that you can encounter in Mystique at this time, there are two levels of difficulty, and it's based on the size of the artifact. So 3x3 artifacts that occupy a 3x3 grid are sort of the easier ones, and the 5x5 grids are the harder ones. Okay, so after this look at symmetry and an assignment, right? I wanted to create a condition where the students could engage with these kinds of exercises above and beyond just doing an assignment. And so I created an online competitive game where it was possible for me to split the class into two teams, two clans, a red team and a blue team. The game involves sort of elements of traditional gameplay interleaved with solving these mystique puzzles that are randomly generated. And the score that an individual has when they play the game, is based on the speed and accuracy in which they solve these puzzles. And then the score for the clan is the average score of the players in the clan. And so in this way, you could have sort of a competitive element to the game, and the hope was that students might play this game more than just once, right? And I have metrics that track all of that behind the scenes. So here's a quick overview of what the game looks like. In the upper left, a player has just captured a will-o'-the-wisp, and now they have to solve a mystique puzzle. The lower images are the various realms that you can be in, and in the upper right, there's a parkour course that lets you choose which realm you want to visit after you've completed all the puzzles in the first realm. All right, so after Triskelion, there comes a lot of coding. And in part, the purpose of this coding is to get students familiar enough with how Bricklayer works and what its capabilities are that they can understand at some level and appreciate how the modeling and simulation might work. And so the first modeling and simulation problem that we look at involves percolation. And the way we're going to model this in Bricklayer is a material is a two-dimensional artifact that is porous. So in this case, you have black cells represent the material itself, and the cells that are not black are empty, and that's the porous nature of the material. So Bricklayer provides a function that creates these kinds of rectangles, having certain densities, having specified densities, and then it provides you with another function that lets you pour water on the top of one of these artifacts. And if the water can flow through the empty cells and reach the bottom, then the material is said to percolate, and otherwise it doesn't. So with these two abstractions, we can now explore the relationship between material density and expected percolation probability. And so the x-axis on the bottom is the site vacancy probability. So if the probability that a cell is empty, is vacant, is 1, then the artifact, the whole artifact that you're creating is empty. And at the other end of the spectrum, the artifact is solid. And in between, you have various artifacts of increasing or decreasing density. And so this now lets us explore the relationship between density and percolation. And so here's a concrete instance of that kind of a question. And so yes, I will write a Bricklayer program, generate a square, pour some water on it, doesn't percolate. I do it again, also doesn't percolate, and I do it again, and this time it percolates, but barely. So maybe I come to the conclusion now after 3 of my tests that 1/3 of the time it percolates. Now that doesn't feel right, because the order of these test results could have been inverted, in which case I would have encountered the percolating case first. So somehow, right, in order to get more accurate results here, we would need to run a bunch of tests and average the results. And so this becomes manually labor intensive. And so to help with this, of course, right, I provide them with a batch testing capability, and now you can't really see the results because you're running a bunch of tests, but you can summarize the results. And so in this case, there were 1,000 tests that were run, and 261 percolated. So 26% of the time, approximately. And these tests sort of exceed manual capabilities. So this gives students some appreciation for the power of the machine and why computational power is important in simulation. And with these kind of more precise answers, we can now explore densities in a certain range and graph the results. And so this is these values were graphed in Excel. And what you see here is a sigmoid, this curve. And it's the standard kind of curve that gets produced when studying these kinds of problems. Now, so at this point, right, we have an understanding between density and percolation. what we want now is to ask the question in reverse. We'd like to know what density is required to have percolate a certain kind of percolation percentage or a probability. And this is sort of the central question in percolation theory, this 50%, or half the time, right, probability of 0.5. At what density is that the case for a material? And this is the percolation threshold. And so, again, one could try to manually search for this, given what we have so far, batch testing and so on. You sort of would, in spirit, right, you create a material of a certain density, you run some tests on it. If it doesn't percolate enough, you reduce the density, run some more tests, and kind of go back and forth. The problem is when you get to high levels of precision, this is a little bit tricky because of the random nature of the materials that are constructed themselves, right? And so to help them with this, we discuss what the problems are. I provide them with a Monte Carlo search function, and where they can now configure this as to how many batch tests they want to run, how many Monte Carlo steps they want to undertake. And so these kinds of percolations, these kinds of simulations can take a lot longer. And the numbers that you see reported here are within the range of what's reported by people that study percolation in earnest. All right, so that gets us to infectious diseases. Now, to be honest, this was inspired by the onset of COVID. So I was watching some YouTube videos with my kids. Primer is the channel, and they have a lot of wonderful videos there. And the video that we were watching involved sort of the various stages of a pandemic. And one of the things I noticed here is that this curve is also a sigmoid. And so I thought, hey, maybe I can kind of quickly adapt some of my percolation theory infrastructure to play with this problem. And so what I have here, right, is two squares. It's not density material now. It is a blue cell is an individual, a person that is susceptible to COVID. A white cell is a person that's masked, and in this model can't catch COVID. And then in the middle of each of these artifacts, I have one cell that represents an infected person. You probably can't see it, or it's hard to see, but now this is the flow through the system is not water now, it is the disease. And so if I run this simulation, right, and I flow the water, or I flow the disease, if you've changed your color, that means you got COVID. And then I can layer on top of that reported hospitalization rates and death rates. And so one thing to notice between these two artifacts is that in one of them, the disease spreads pretty extensively, in the other one, it doesn't. This is, of course, just a single test again, but the reason why this is happening is because we're on either side of this percolation threshold. So, and this kind of relates a little bit to herd immunity and stuff like this as well. So, it may be interesting that for a government, right, if their population is close to this threshold, it may be worth going the extra mile to get just a few more people to wear masks or take mitigation steps. So that kind of exploration, right? I developed a Bricklayer library that allows you to sort of study this a little bit more precisely. And so people don't move in this model. This is a cell-based model, but they do have a radius of interaction. So social distancing, you can model R naught. You can use both normal and uniform random number generators in your simulators. And there are variables to let you describe other factors such as natural immunity or masking, the effects of that. You can control the size of the initially infected population. It's not just one person, and the number of transmission steps. And then you get Bricklayer will provide you with an analysis of the results of this kind of a simulation. So here is an example, right? So in this population, everybody is susceptible. Nobody's wearing a mask. I've plunked down initially 10 people that had COVID, and the social radius, this society is on lockdown. The social radius here is 0, and 0 here means the von Neumann neighborhood, so north, south, east, west. And so I'm exploring how, and if you're red, you have COVID, and if you're gray, you had COVID. and I'm not modeling death rates or hospitalization rates here. And so I can kind of see as some number of transmission steps into the simulation how the disease spreads through the population. Now, I would expect ultimately this, like a fire, is going to burn most of the blue stuff, right? Eventually. It's just a question of how fast. And so here's a similar simulation, except everything else is the same except for the social radius. And the social radius here is 20. And so what that means is, think of a square whose side is 41, and where the individual is in the exact center of that square. That's the social radius for this simulation. And we're running at the same number of simulation steps. So the snapshots correspond, right? So the disease spreads much more quickly and extensively, right? So, of course, that was just one simulation, right? I may want to ask a question, how many transmission steps into a simulation, what percentage of the population can I expect to be infected under a certain set of assumptions? And so now we get to this same problem again, where one test isn't enough. You have to do a bunch of tests and average the results. And then, so here's an example of that from the previous experiment, right? The first one that I showed. And so basically some number of transmission steps into this simulation. The single example that I did, the single simulation said that 2.4% of the population was going to be infected, and the batch simulation said a lower number. All right, that pretty much concludes my talk. Any questions?